she was born into luxury, crowned a queen, and blamed for a nation's collapse, all before her 40th birthday. Tonight, we gently unravel the life of Marie Antoinette, the misunderstood monarch whose name echoed through the chaos of the French Revolution. Behind the powdered wigs, candlelit halls, and infamous words like "let them eat cake" was a girl caught in the storm of history. So rest your head, dust, and drift into a world of palaces, politics, and a queen history couldn't forget, if quiet tales of royalty, revolution, and resilience help calm your heart at night. Then you've found the right place. Subscribe now and tap the bell icon to return each night to stories that soothe, surprise, and slowly lull you to sleep. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time is it for you right now? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. On the crisp morning of November the 2nd, 1755, in the vast corridors of the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, you would have heard the cries of a newborn baby echoing through the imperial chambers. This was no ordinary birth, for this child would one day become one of history's most famous queens. Born to Empress Maria Theresa, the formidable ruler of the Habsburg Empire, and Holy Roman Emperor Francis I, little Maria Antonia Anna Josepha came into the world as the 15th of 16 children in one of Europe's most powerful families. The moment of her birth was recorded with the meticulous precision that marked all Habsburg court proceedings. The infant was immediately placed in the care of Countess von Brandeis, the governess of the imperial children, a woman whose stern demeanor and unwavering dedication to protocol would shape the early years of the future Marie Antoinette. You can imagine the nursery at the Hofburg, vast rooms with impossibly high ceilings, adorned with golden moldings and heavy tapestries, where servants moved quietly in their daily routines, tending to the newest member of the imperial family. But child's godparents were King Joseph I of Portugal and his wife Mariana Victoria, though they were represented by proxies at the baptism, Archduke Joseph and Archduchess Maria Anna. This detail, seemingly mundane, reveals the intricate web of European royal connections that would eventually lead this Austrian Archduchess to the throne of France. Every aspect of her early life was conducted according to rigid protocols that had governed the Habsburg court for centuries. Maria Antonia's world during her first years was one of structured luxury. The imperial nursery operated on a schedule as precise as clockwork. Feeding times, bathing rituals, and supervised play periods were all carefully regulated. The Countess von Brandeis maintained detailed records of every aspect of the child's development, when she first smiled, her first words, her first steps, all documented for the imperial archives. These mundane details of royal child-rearing, while perhaps tedious to read about, formed the foundation of a life that would later be scrutinized by millions. The Habsburg court during Maria Antonia's infancy was a world unto itself, with over 1,000 courtiers, servants, and officials moving through the palace corridors daily. Each person had their designated role, from the highest-ranking lady-in-waiting to the humblest scullery maid. The infant Archduchess existed at the center of this elaborate machinery, her every need anticipated and met before she could even express it. Wet nurses were carefully selected and monitored, her clothing was sewn by the finest seamstresses in Vienna, and even her toys were crafted by the most skilled artisans in the empire. Life at the Hofburg followed the rhythm of the seasons and the Catholic calendar. During Advent, the palace would be decorated with evergreen boughs and candles, and young Maria Antonia would be brought to witness the elaborate Christmas celebrations in the palace chapel. Easter brought its own set of ceremonies and traditions with painted eggs and special masses that marked the liturgical year. These early experiences of pageantry and religious observance would stay with her throughout her life, informing her understanding of royal duty and divine appointment. The relationship between Maria Theresa and her youngest daughter was complex from the beginning. The Empress, who had borne 16 children in 19 years while simultaneously ruling one of Europe's largest empires, had little time for intimate maternal bonding, yet she was deeply invested in the futures of all her children, viewing them as valuable diplomatic assets in the complex game of European politics. Maria Antonia represented a potential alliance with France, Austria's traditional enemy, and this knowledge colored every decision about her upbringing. The daily routine of the imperial nursery was governed by principles that would seem almost militaristic to modern parents. Maria Antonia was awakened each morning at precisely 7 o'clock, regardless of the season or weather. Her first meal of thin gruel was served in a silver bowl bearing the Habsburg coat of arms. She was then bathed in water heated to an exact temperature and dressed in clothes that had been selected according to strict protocols governing royal infant attire. Even her playtime was structured with approved toys and supervised interactions with carefully chosen companions. As Maria Antonia grew from infant to toddler, the palace staff began to notice her particular temperament. Unlike some of her more serious siblings, she was described as having an irrepressible spirit and an infectious laugh that could brighten even the most formal court gatherings. The Countess von Brandeis noted in her reports that the young Archduchess showed early signs of the charm that would later captivate the French court, but also exhibited a tendency toward distraction and restlessness that would prove challenging for her future education. How did this structured yet luxurious early childhood shape the woman who would one day face the French Revolutionary Tribunal? What dreams and fears might have visited this little girl as she slept in her golden cradle, surrounded by the whispers of court intrigue and the weight of imperial expectations? Maria Antonia's relationship with her father, Emperor Francis I, stood in stark contrast to the formal distance maintained by her mother. Francis was known throughout the court for his affectionate nature and his particular fondness for his youngest daughter. Court observers noted how his eyes would light up when she entered a room and how he would interrupt even important state meetings to receive her childish embraces. This paternal affection created a refuge of warmth in the otherwise rigid structure of imperial life. The emperor's love for Maria Antonia manifested in countless small gestures that palace servants would later recall with fondness. He would carry sweets in his pocket specifically for her, and was known to delay departure for hunting expeditions or diplomatic missions if it meant missing her morning greeting. When Maria Antonia was 9 years old, Francis insisted on holding up an entire imperial procession so he could embrace his daughter one final time before departing on what would prove to be his last journey. "I long to kiss that child," he explained to the impatient courtiers, little knowing that his daughter would never see him again. The Empress, while more distant, was no less invested in her daughter's future. Maria Theresa approached child-rearing with the same systematic thoroughness she applied to governing her empire. She maintained detailed correspondence with governesses and tutors, reviewing reports on each child's progress and prescribing specific remedies for any deficiencies. Her letters regarding Maria Antonia reveal a growing concern about the child's educational development, particularly her apparent lack of interest in scholarly pursuits. Daily life for Maria Antonia was divided between two primary residences: the formal Hofburg Palace in the city and the more relaxed atmosphere of Schönbrunn Palace, the imperial family's summer retreat. At Schönbrunn, the rigid protocols of court life were somewhat relaxed, allowing for more natural family interactions. It was here that Maria Antonia spent her happiest childhood hours, playing in the vast gardens with her closest sibling and companion, Maria Carolina, who was 3 years her senior. The two sisters were inseparable, creating elaborate games of make-believe among the perfectly manicured hedges and ornamental fountains of Schönbrunn's gardens. They would pretend to be fairy tale princesses, complete with imaginary kingdoms and loyal subjects drawn from the patient gardening staff who tolerated their childish fantasies. These games often involved elaborate ceremonies and mock court proceedings, unconsciously preparing Maria Antonia for the real ceremonies that would dominate her adult life. Maria Antonia's formal education began when she was 6 years old, following the traditional Habsburg curriculum designed for imperial children. Her first governess, a woman whose name has been lost to history, but whose permissive nature would later be deemed inadequate, allowed the young archduchess considerable freedom in her studies. This early period was characterized by what court observers described as effortless evasion of educational directives, as Maria Antonia developed an early talent for charming her way out of lessons that bored her. The daily educational schedule was exhaustive in its scope and boring in its execution. Mornings began with religious instruction, conducted in Latin by a court chaplain who droned through biblical passages while Maria Antonia fidgeted in her chair. This was followed by French language lessons conducted by a stern Parisian tutor, who had been specially imported for the purpose. The importance of French could not be overstated. It was the language of diplomacy, culture, and refinement throughout European courts. Mathematical instruction followed a rigid pattern of memorization and recitation. Maria Antonia was expected to master addition, subtraction, and basic geometric principles, though her attention frequently wandered to the activities visible through the classroom windows. History lessons focused primarily on Habsburg family, genealogy, and the military campaigns that had expanded and defended the empire. Geography involved memorizing the boundaries and capitals of European kingdoms, with particular emphasis on potential marriage alliances. The results of this educational regimen were, by all accounts, disappointing. At age 10, Maria Antonia could not write correctly in German, her native language, nor in French or Italian, the languages commonly used at court. Her handwriting was so poor that her governess resorted to writing her assignments in pencil first, allowing Maria Antonia to trace over the letters in ink before presenting them to the Empress for review. This deception, while solving the immediate problem, failed to address the underlying issues with her education. Conversations with Maria Antonia during this period were described as stilted, suggesting that her verbal skills were as underdeveloped as her written communication. Yet in other areas she showed remarkable aptitude. Under the instruction of Christoph Willibald Gluck, the renowned composer who served the Habsburg court, she developed considerable musical talent. She learned to play the harp, harpsichord, and flute with skill that impressed even the most demanding court musicians. Her musical abilities were showcased during the family's evening gatherings, intimate affairs where the imperial children were expected to demonstrate their accomplishments. Maria Antonia would perform both instrumental pieces and vocal selections, her clear soprano voice carrying through the ornate salon where her parents and select courtiers would gather. These performances represented some of her few, unqualified successes during her childhood education. The most famous incident of Maria Antonia's childhood occurred on October 13, 1762, when 6-year-old Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was invited to perform for the imperial family at Schönbrunn. The child prodigy, only 2 months younger than Maria Antonia, slipped on the polished floor during his performance. Without hesitation, 7-year-old Maria Antonia ran to help him up, demonstrating the spontaneous kindness that would characterize her throughout her life. This gesture, witnessed by dozens of courtiers, was recorded in numerous memoirs and letters, becoming one of the few purely positive anecdotes from her Austrian childhood. But beneath the surface of these charming incidents lay growing concern about Maria Antonia's future. As the political situation in Europe shifted and negotiations for her eventual marriage to the French Dauphin gained momentum, the inadequacies in her education became a source of increasing anxiety for Empress Maria Theresa. How could this poorly educated, easily distracted child possibly succeed as Queen of France, a position that would require her to navigate the most sophisticated and treacherous court in Europe? By 1768, when Maria Antonia was 13 years old, it had become clear that her casual approach to education would not suffice for her destined role as Dauphine of France. The marriage negotiations between Austria and France had reached a critical stage, and Empress Maria Theresa recognized that her daughter required intensive preparation for the sophisticated French court. What followed was perhaps the most comprehensive royal makeover in European history, a project that would consume the final years of Maria Antonia's Austrian childhood. The transformation began with the dismissal of the permissive governess who had allowed Maria Antonia to drift through her early education. In her place, the Empress assembled a team of the most qualified instructors available in Europe. To oversee this educational reformation, she confined Maria Antonia to Schönbrunn Palace along with her new tutors, creating an intensive learning environment designed to rapidly improve her skills in the areas deemed essential for her future role. The crown jewel of this educational team was the Abbé de Vermont, a carefully selected representative of the French court who had been sent specifically to prepare Maria Antonia for life at Versailles. Vermont was a man of considerable patience and pedagogical skill, but even he found his young pupil challenging. In his reports to both the Austrian and French courts, he documented the extent of the educational gaps that needed to be addressed and the innovative methods he developed to work around Maria Antonia's learning style. Whatever information she absorbed was going to have to be spoon-fed to her, Vermont reported to his superiors. Rather than forcing her to engage with traditional textbook learning, he adapted his approach to emphasize conversation and practical application. "I keep the studies as much as possible to the forms of conversation," he wrote, recognizing that Maria Antonia learned best through interactive discussion rather than rote memorization. The daily schedule during this intensive preparation period was exhausting in its thoroughness. Maria Antonia's day began at 6 in the morning with private prayer and reflection, followed by a light breakfast during which Vermont would engage her in informal French conversation. Formal French grammar and composition occupied the morning hours, with Vermont patiently correcting her pronunciation and helping her master the subtle nuances of expression that would be expected at the French court. Afternoons were devoted to what might be called cultural immersion. Maria Antonia was required to read French literature, though her selection was carefully curated to include works that would prepare her for the intellectual climate she would encounter at Versailles. She studied the writings of Voltaire and other French philosophers, though the more controversial political ideas were carefully edited or explained in ways that would not challenge her fundamental acceptance of royal authority. History lessons during this period focused intensively on French royal genealogy and the complex relationships between the various noble families that comprised the French court. Maria Antonia memorized the names, titles, and family connections of hundreds of French nobles, learning not just their identities, but also their political allegiances and potential influence on court dynamics. This information was presented as a vast social map that she would need to navigate successfully. Dancing instruction occupied a significant portion of each day, as court dancing was considered an essential skill for royal women. A master from Paris was retained specifically for this purpose, teaching Maria Antonia the intricate steps and elaborate gestures that characterized French court dance. These lessons were exhausting, requiring precise coordination and stamina, but they also served to improve her posture and overall physical presence. Perhaps most challenging was the instruction in French court etiquette, a system so complex that it required months of study to master even the basic principles. Maria Antonia learned the precise protocols for greeting different ranks of nobility, the proper procedures for formal dining, and the elaborate ceremonies that marked every aspect of court life. She practiced walking with the specific gait required
of French royalty, holding her head at the precise angle that conveyed appropriate dignity without appearing haughty. The psychological pressure of this intensive preparation was considerable.
Maria Antonia was constantly reminded that her success or failure would reflect not only on herself, but on the entire Austrian Empire. The marriage alliance with France represented the culmination of decades of diplomatic effort, and any misstep on her part could have far-reaching political consequences. This burden weighed heavily on a teenage girl who had previously lived a relatively carefree existence. Letters from this period reveal the emotional toll of the transformation process. Maria Antonia wrote to her sister Maria Carolina about feeling overwhelmed by the constant scrutiny and criticism. Even her handwriting, which had previously been a source of embarrassment, became the subject of intensive remedial instruction. Hours each day were devoted to penmanship exercises, with Maria Antonia practicing the elegant script that would be expected in her future correspondence. The arrival of French tutors who had been specially hired to teach her the subtle rules of conduct at the French court marked a new phase in her preparation. These instructors brought with them detailed knowledge of life at Versailles, including information about the personalities and preferences of the royal family she would soon join. They taught her about French fashion, French cuisine, and French cultural preferences, gradually reshaping her Austrian sensibilities to align with French expectations. Music remained one area where Maria Antonia continued to excel during this difficult period. Her musical accomplishments were seen as potentially valuable assets for court life, as the French royal family was known to appreciate artistic talent. She expanded her repertoire to include French compositions and learned to sing French songs with proper pronunciation and emotional expression. By the spring of 1770, after more than a year of intensive preparation, the transformation was deemed complete. Abbé Vermond reported that while Maria Antonia still struggled with spelling and writing due to idleness and inattention, her French pronunciation had improved dramatically, and she had developed sufficient knowledge of French court customs to navigate her new environment successfully. The question that remained was whether this crash course in royal sophistication would be enough to prepare her for the challenges that lay ahead. As spring turned to summer in 1770, the final preparations began for Maria Antonia's departure from
Austria. What must it have felt like for this 15-year-old girl to know that she was about to leave behind everything familiar, her family, her language, her homeland, to begin a new life in a foreign country where she would be expected
to embody perfection from the moment of her arrival? On the morning of April 21st, 1770, the imperial summer palace of Schönbrunn was transformed into a staging ground for one of the most elaborate bridal processions in European history. As the clock struck 9, a magnificent procession consisting of 21 state coaches, followed by 36 fine carriages, drawn by 450 horses and accompanied by a personal suite of 257 people, began its stately departure from the palace grounds. This was no ordinary journey. It was a carefully choreographed diplomatic spectacle that would take 2.5 weeks to transport the future Marie Antoinette from her Austrian childhood to her French destiny. The organization required for such an undertaking was staggering in its complexity. Months of advanced planning had gone into every aspect of the journey, from the selection of horses and their replacement schedule to the precise timing of ceremonial stops along the route. The imperial household had coordinated with local authorities across multiple kingdoms to ensure that roads were passable, accommodations were prepared, and provisions were available for the massive entourage. Maria Antonia herself rode in one of 2 specially prepared carriages that had been brought from France by the Marquis de Durfort, the French ambassador extraordinary who would oversee her formal handover to French custody. One carriage was decorated in crimson velvet with gold braiding, while the other featured blue silk appointments with silver trim. These vehicles represented the finest examples of 18th century carriage craftsmanship, with suspension systems designed to provide the smoothest possible ride over the often rough roads of the era. The composition of Maria Antonia's travelling household reflected the diplomatic importance of the marriage alliance. Prince Starhemberg, Maria Theresa's chief chamberlain, led the Austrian delegation, while the Princess of Par served as her mistress of the court. The entourage included ladies-in-waiting and maids of honor, chamberlains, secretaries, lackeys, cooks, and even more obscurely titled servants, such as a sugar inspector, whose duties presumably involved ensuring that the bride's sweet tooth would be properly catered to throughout the journey. The daily routine of the procession was as carefully regulated as life at court itself. Each morning began before dawn with the complex process of preparing the carriages and horses for the day's travel. Servants would inspect every piece of equipment, checking wheels, harnesses, and the elaborate decorations that adorned the vehicles. The horses were groomed to perfection, their coats brushed until they gleamed, and their manes braided with ribbons that matched the colors of the imperial livery. Maria Antonia's personal preparations each morning were conducted according to protocols that had been established specifically for the journey. She was awakened at precisely 6 o'clock by her personal attendants, who would help her dress in traveling attire that had been selected the previous evening based on the weather forecast and the planned activities for the day. Her breakfast was served on fine porcelain that traveled in specially cushioned containers, ensuring that even the most basic meal maintained the elegance expected of an imperial repast. The psychological impact of this departure cannot be overstated. For Maria Antonia, this journey represented not just a change of residence, but a fundamental transformation of identity. She was leaving behind not only her family and friends, but also her name, her nationality, and her familiar way of life. The ceremonial nature of the departure emphasized this finality. Once the procession left Austrian territory, there would be no return to her former existence. The route itself had been planned to showcase the power and reach of the Habsburg Empire while providing appropriate opportunities for diplomatic ceremonies along the way. The procession would cross much of the Holy Roman Empire, traveling through territories that recognized the authority of Maria Antonia's father and demonstrating the extent of Austrian influence in European affairs. Each border crossing was marked by formal ceremonies that reinforced the political significance of the marriage alliance. The first day's travel covered approximately 20 miles, a distance that might seem modest by modern standards, but represented a significant undertaking for such a large entourage. The procession moved at a stately pace that allowed for proper ceremony at each stop, while also ensuring the comfort and safety of all participants. Advanced scouts had prepared each segment of the route, identifying potential problems and coordinating with local authorities to address any issues before the main party arrived. Evening accommodations had been arranged well in advance, often utilizing monasteries and castles that could accommodate the Dauphine and her suite. These locations were selected not only for their capacity, but also for their symbolic appropriateness. Monasteries provided opportunities for religious observance and highlighted the Catholic identity that Austria and France shared. Castles demonstrated the continuity of noble privilege and reinforced the hierarchical order that the marriage alliance was designed to preserve. The logistics of feeding such a large group required careful coordination between the imperial household and local suppliers. Roads had to be made passable, streets improved, and food and fine cutlery sourced in sufficient quantity for the entire entourage. Local nobles were expected to contribute to these preparations as a demonstration of their loyalty to the imperial family and their support for the marriage alliance. Each evening's entertainment was carefully planned to reflect both the solemnity of the occasion and the joy appropriate to a wedding celebration. Musicians were engaged to perform during dinner, and local dignitaries were invited to pay their respects to the future Dauphin of France. These gatherings provided opportunities for Maria Antonia to practice the social skills she had learned during her intensive preparation period, while also allowing local nobles to demonstrate their importance through association with the imperial family. The weather during the first week of travel was generally favorable, with spring sunshine and mild temperatures that made the journey pleasant for all involved. However, the constant attention and ceremony were exhausting for Maria Antonia, who was still adjusting to the reality of her changed circumstances. Letters written during this period reveal her growing homesickness and anxiety about the unknown life that awaited her in France. As the procession made its way across the Austrian countryside, villagers lined the roads to catch glimpses of their future Queen of France. These encounters with ordinary people provided some relief from the formal protocols that governed most aspects of the journey, allowing Maria Antonia to experience the genuine affection that common people felt for the imperial family. These moments of human connection would later prove to be among her most cherished memories of the journey. What thoughts occupied Maria Antonia's mind during those long hours in the carriage as the familiar landscapes of her childhood gradually gave way to foreign territories? How did she reconcile her excitement about her approaching marriage with her grief at leaving everything she had ever known? As the imperial procession approached the boundaries between Austrian and French territory, the ceremonial aspects of Maria Antonia's journey intensified dramatically. The formal handover of a royal bride between nations required elaborate protocols that had been developed over centuries of European diplomatic practice. What awaited Maria Antonia at the border was not merely a change of escorts, but a ritual transformation that would symbolically strip away her Austrian identity and remake her as a French princess. The location chosen for this ceremony was a small island in the Rhine River near Strasbourg, a carefully neutral territory that belonged to neither Austria nor France. A special pavilion had been constructed specifically for the occasion, divided precisely in half, with one side decorated in Austrian colors and the other in French blue and gold. This architectural metaphor would serve as the stage for one of the most psychologically intense experiences of Maria Antonia's young life. The ceremony of remise, or handover, was scheduled for May 7, 1770, after the procession had travelled for more than 2 weeks across the Holy Roman Empire. During this journey, Maria Antonia had grown accustomed to her role as an Austrian archduchess, receiving homage from her father's subjects. Now she would be required to surrender that identity entirely and emerge as Marie Antoinette, Dauphine of France, subject to an entirely different set of expectations and protocols. The ritual itself was both magnificent and deeply unsettling. Maria Antonia entered the pavilion from the Austrian side, accompanied by Prince Starhemberg and the other Austrian officials who had escorted her from Vienna. In the center of the structure, she was required to remove every article of clothing and personal belongings that she had brought from Austria. This symbolic stripping away of her national identity was conducted with elaborate ceremony, but the psychological impact was profound. Standing naked in the neutral space between her old and new identities, Maria Antonia was then dressed entirely in French garments that had been prepared for the occasion. Every item from her undergarments to her jewelry had been selected to reflect French taste and French craftsmanship. Even her personal effects were replaced with French equivalents. Her Austrian prayer book was exchanged for a French missal. Her German correspondence was replaced with French writing materials, and her Austrian coins were substituted with French currency. The transformation extended beyond mere clothing to encompass every aspect of her material existence. The Austrian servants who had cared for her during the journey were dismissed and replaced with French attendants who had been selected specifically for their knowledge of Versailles protocol. These new servants had been instructed in her personal preferences and habits, but their primary loyalty was to the French court rather than to their new mistress's comfort or happiness. When Maria Antonia emerged from the French side of the pavilion, she was no longer an Austrian archduchess, but Marie Antoinette, Dauphine of France. The Austrian officials who had accompanied her from Vienna were now required to treat her as a foreign dignitary rather than as a member of their own imperial family. This ceremonial distance emphasized the finality of her transformation and the complete nature of her separation from her homeland. The psychological impact of this ceremony was intensified by its very public nature. Hundreds of dignitaries from both courts witnessed the proceedings, along with local nobles and officials who had been granted permission to attend this historic occasion. For a 15-year-old girl who had lived her entire life within the protective embrace of her family, this exposure was both thrilling and terrifying. The French courtiers who now surrounded Marie Antoinette were led by the Comtesse de Noailles, who would serve as her chief lady-in-waiting and guide to French court etiquette. The Comtesse was known for her rigid adherence to protocol and her exacting standards for royal behavior. From the moment Marie Antoinette emerged from the pavilion, she was subject to the Comtesse's constant supervision and correction, a stark contrast to the more relaxed Austrian approach to royal deportment. The journey from the border to Versailles took an additional week, but the character of the procession had changed dramatically. Where the Austrian portion of the journey had emphasized family connections and imperial tradition, the French segment focused on introducing Marie Antoinette to her new subjects and demonstrating the wealth and power of the French monarchy. Each town along the route had prepared elaborate celebrations, including triumphal arches, fireworks, musical performances, and theatrical entertainments. The French approach to royal ceremonial was notably different from Austrian practices, where the Habsburg court emphasized dignity and restraint. The French preferred spectacle and magnificence. Marie Antoinette found herself the center of increasingly elaborate displays designed to demonstrate French cultural superiority and artistic achievement. These celebrations were exhausting for someone who had been traveling for nearly 3 weeks, but they provided her first introduction to the theatrical nature of French court life. Local nobles competed to host the most impressive entertainments for the future Dauphine. Wine flowed freely at every stop, elaborate meals were prepared by the finest chefs available, and musicians and dancers performed works commissioned specifically for the occasion. Marie Antoinette was expected to acknowledge these offerings with appropriate grace while maintaining the dignity befitting her new rank. The final week of travel also provided Marie Antoinette's first real interaction with her French attendants. These women, selected for their knowledge of Versailles customs and their loyalty to the royal family, began the process of preparing her for life at the most complex court in Europe. They instructed her in the subtle distinctions between different ranks of French nobility, the proper forms of address for various court positions, and the intricate etiquette that governed every aspect of royal existence. The contrast between French and Austrian approaches to royal education became apparent during these instructional sessions. Where her Austrian tutors had emphasized moral duty and religious devotion, her French advisors focused on social graces and political awareness. They taught her to recognize the hidden meanings in court conversation, to navigate the complex web of relationships between noble families, and to maintain her composure under the constant scrutiny that characterized life at Versailles. As the procession approached Paris, Marie Antoinette's anxiety about her approaching marriage intensified. She had never met her future husband, the Dauphin Louis Auguste, and had only formal portraits and diplomatic reports to guide her expectations. The success of the marriage alliance depended not only on the political benefits it would provide, but also on the personal compatibility between two young people who were essentially strangers to each other. Letters written during this final week reveal Marie Antoinette's growing awareness of the enormous responsibility that rested on her shoulders. She was no longer simply a young woman preparing for marriage, but a diplomatic representative whose every action would be scrutinized for its implications regarding the relationship between Austria and France. The weight of these expectations was overwhelming for someone who had previously lived a relatively sheltered existence. How did this systematic erasure of her Austrian identity affect Marie Antoinette's sense of self? What did it mean for a 15-year-old girl to have every familiar object and trusted companion replaced with foreign equivalents during a single ceremony? And how would this experience of enforced transformation influence her later relationships with the French court and the French people? The final leg of Marie Antoinette's journey culminated on May 14, 1770, when the French procession reached Compiègne, where she would meet her future husband for the first time. This encounter had been carefully choreographed by court officials, but no amount of planning could completely eliminate the nervousness that both young people felt as they approached this crucial moment. The first meeting between Marie Antoinette and Dauphin Louis Auguste was destined to take place in a setting designed to emphasize the grandeur of the French monarchy while providing some privacy for the awkward introductions. King Louis V had orchestrated the meeting with theatrical precision. As Marie Antoinette's carriage approached the designated meeting point, she could see through the windows a gathering of magnificently dressed courtiers surrounding a young man who could only be her future husband. The Dauphin Louis Auguste, then 15 years old, was described by observers as awkward and heavyset, with a shy demeanor that contrasted sharply with the confident bearing expected of French royalty. The initial greeting between the future spouses followed strict protocol. Marie Antoinette descended from her carriage and curtsied deeply to the Dauphin, who responded with a formal bow. Their first words to each other were carefully scripted pleasantries exchanged in the presence of dozens of witnesses. Contemporary accounts suggest that both young people were visibly nervous, with Marie Antoinette's cheeks flushed from excitement and anxiety, while Louis Auguste appeared tongue-tied and uncomfortable. The journey from Compiègne to Versailles on May 16th provided Marie Antoinette with her first glimpse of the palace that would become her home for the next 19 years. As the procession approached the magnificent chateau, she could see the vast gardens stretching to the horizon, the countless windows reflecting the morning sun, and the throngs of courtiers and servants who had gathered to witness her arrival. The scale of Versailles dwarfed even the grandest Austrian palaces, emphasizing the wealth and power of the French monarchy. Upon arrival at Versailles, Marie Antoinette was greeted by King Louis XV on the ground floor of the palace, where he conversed with her for some time before presenting her to other members of the royal family. These introductions followed a precise hierarchy that reinforced the complex social structure of the French court. She met Madame Elisabeth, the king's youngest daughter, the Comtesse de Clermont, and the Princesse de Conti, each greeting requiring specific protocols that Marie Antoinette had memorized during her preparation period. The wedding ceremony itself was scheduled for the same day as her arrival, leaving no time for rest or private preparation. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the cortege formed in the king's apartment and proceeded to the royal chapel, a magnificent space that had been decorated with thousands of flowers and illuminated by hundreds of candles. The chapel's soaring architecture and elaborate decorations created an atmosphere of sacred majesty that emphasized the divine nature of royal authority. The ceremony began with the Dauphin and Dauphine advancing toward the altar and kneeling on cushions placed on the steps of the sanctuary. The Archbishop of Reims, Monseigneur de la Roche-Aymon, who served as Grand Almoner, conducted the service with elaborate ritual precision. He offered them holy water as a symbol of purification, then delivered an exhortation on the duties and responsibilities of Christian marriage. The blessing of the wedding gifts followed ancient tradition. The Archbishop blessed 13 pieces of gold and the wedding ring, symbols of prosperity and fidelity that had been used in French royal weddings for centuries. The Dauphin then placed the ring on Marie Antoinette's fourth finger and presented her with the gold pieces, formal gestures that completed the legal aspect of their union under both civil and canon law. The nuptial benediction pronounced by the Archbishop carried particular weight in an age when royal marriages were understood to be blessed by divine authority. As soon as the king had returned to his prie-dieu, the wedding mass began with elaborate musical accompaniment. The royal choir sang a motet by the Abbé de Ganzague, their voices rising to fill the chapel's vaulted ceiling with harmonies that had been composed specifically for this historic occasion. During the offertory, the newly married couple went forward to make their offering, a symbolic gift to the altar that demonstrated their devotion and thanksgiving. This moment provided the congregation with their clearest view of the new Dauphine, who moved with the grace that had been drilled into her during months of preparation, but still showed signs of the nervousness that any bride might feel during such a momentous ceremony. At the Pater Noster, a canopy of silver brocade was spread above the heads of the royal couple, held by the Bishop of Senlis on the Dauphin's side and the Bishop of Chartres on the Dauphine's side. This canopy served both practical and symbolic purposes, providing a sense of sacred space around the couple while demonstrating the Church's protection and blessing of their union. The conclusion of the Mass was marked by the presentation of the marriage register, which the curé of the royal parish carried to the king's prie-dieu for his signature as the primary witness. This document would serve as the legal record of the marriage, but it also represented the formal acceptance of Marie Antoinette into the French royal family and the line of succession. The return procession to the king's apartment followed the same elaborate protocol as the arrival, but now Marie Antoinette processed as a married woman and future Queen of France. The transformation was complete. The Austrian Archduchess, who had entered the chapel, was gone, replaced by the French Dauphine, who would spend the rest of her life navigating the complexities of Versailles. The evening's festivities included elaborate dinners, musical performances, and dancing that continued well into the night. Marie Antoinette was expected to participate graciously in all these celebrations while adjusting to her new status and the constant attention of the French court. The exhaustion she must have felt after weeks of travel and the emotional intensity of the wedding ceremony was compounded by the knowledge that her new life was only beginning. The final ceremony of the wedding day was the ritual bedding, a traditional practice that emphasized the political importance of royal consummation. This intimate moment was conducted under the watchful eyes of court officials who needed to witness the completion of the marriage alliance. For two inexperienced teenagers, this public scrutiny of their most private moments must have been deeply uncomfortable and potentially traumatic. As the wedding day concluded and Marie Antoinette prepared for her first night as Dauphine of France, what thoughts and fears might have filled her mind? How did this 15-year-old girl process the magnitude of the changes that had occurred in her life over the course of a single day? And what dreams or nightmares might have visited her as she fell asleep in her new home, surrounded by strangers? Who would now determine the course of her daily existence? The daily existence of Marie Antoinette at Versailles was governed by protocols so elaborate and time-consuming that they transformed even the most basic human activities into complex ceremonial performances. Each morning began at 8 o'clock, when she awakened, not to privacy and personal choice, but to an immediate surrender of autonomy that would characterize every moment of her waking hours. The very act of getting dressed became a theatrical production involving dozens of participants, each with specifically defined roles in the grand spectacle of royal existence. The first person to enter the Queen's chamber was a woman of the wardrobe, carrying a basket containing what were euphemistically called offerings. These offerings included fresh chemises, handkerchiefs, and towels, but the term reflected the quasi-religious nature of royal service, where attending to the monarch's body was considered a sacred privilege rather than mere domestic labor. The selection and presentation of these items followed rules so complex that they required years of training to master completely. Following closely behind came the first waiting woman, bearing the Gazette des Atours, an elaborate book containing fabric swatches and detailed descriptions of every garment in the Queen's extensive wardrobe. Marie Antoinette was expected to make her clothing selections for the day from this book, though her choices were constrained by protocols that dictated appropriate attire for different types of activities and seasons. The decision-making process that might take a private citizen mere minutes required careful consideration of political implications, weather conditions, and scheduled appearances. The morning bath represented one of the few moments of relative privacy in Marie Antoinette's day. She bathed behind a sheet held by attendants to shield her body from view, a practice that provided minimal physical modesty while maintaining the fiction that royal bodies were somehow different from those of ordinary mortals. The water temperature was carefully regulated, scented with oils selected according to her preferences, and the entire process was conducted with the silent efficiency that characterized all aspects of royal service. After bathing, Marie Antoinette returned to bed, wearing a white taffeta cloak, where she engaged in embroidery or reading while awaiting the next phase of her morning routine. This interlude allowed for some personal choice in activities, though even her reading material was subject to scrutiny and approval by court officials who monitored everything that might influence royal thinking. The embroidery work served both as appropriate feminine occupation and as a means of creating gifts for courtiers and family members. Breakfast was served at 9 o'clock, consisting of simple fare such as hot chocolate or coffee presented on fine porcelain bearing the royal arms. The meal was placed on a tray positioned on a specially designed coffee table, and during this time, intimates were permitted to enter the royal chamber for informal conversation. These breakfast conversations represented some of the most natural social interaction Marie Antoinette experienced, though even these casual moments were governed by protocols determining who could speak, when, and about what topics. At 10 o'clock, Marie Antoinette began her official duties with visits to the king's aunts, elderly princesses whose approval was essential for maintaining harmonious relationships within the royal family. These visits required careful attention to precedents and protocol, as the aunts were known for their rigid adherence to traditional etiquette and their willingness to report any perceived slights to the king. Following these obligatory family visits, she would proceed to the king's apartments for what was often the most politically significant encounter of her day. The hairdressing ceremony at 11 o'clock marked the beginning of the most elaborate portion of Marie Antoinette's morning routine. This process required the services of specialized professionals who were considered artists in their own right, capable of creating the towering structures and intricate decorations that characterized 18th century royal coiffures. The king's brothers usually arrived during this ceremony, and after the completion of her hairstyle, Marie Antoinette was required to curtsy to everyone present in the room, a gesture that acknowledged their rank while displaying her own magnificence. The Grande Toilette began at noon and represented the ceremonial climax of Marie Antoinette's morning. Folding chairs were arranged in a circle around the center of the room, where high officials, including the superintendent, ladies of honor, ladies of the bedchamber, the governess, princes, captains, and clergy, gathered to witness the Queen's transformation from private person to public symbol. This ceremony was attended by anyone of sufficient rank to merit inclusion, creating an audience that might number in the dozens. The toilet table used during this ceremony was elaborate beyond modern comprehension, equipped with every conceivable cosmetic and grooming tool required for royal beautification. The application of cosmetics followed a precise sequence: cleansing, whitening powder, rouge for the cheeks, pomade for the lips, and the strategic placement of mouche, small beauty patches that Marie Antoinette favored partially because she had survived smallpox as a child and used them to cover any remaining scars. The finishing touch was always one of her favorite scents, usually eau de fleur d'oranger, an orange blossom water that became so associated with her that courtiers could detect her approach by fragrance alone. The dressing protocol during the Grande Toilette was so complex that it required multiple participants with specifically defined roles. The Lady of Honor handed Marie Antoinette her chemise and poured water for hand washing, while the lady of the bedchamber passed the components of her gown, arranged her fichu, and clasped her necklace. Most remarkably, nothing was ever passed directly to the Queen. If she requested something as simple as a glass of water, it was presented first to the first waiting woman, then passed to the Lady of Honor if she was present, and potentially transferred through several more hands if someone of higher rank entered the room before finally reaching its intended recipient. This elaborate system of indirect service reflected the hierarchical nature of court society, where even the smallest gesture reinforced social distinctions and royal supremacy. The inefficiency was intentional. The point was not to serve the Queen's needs quickly or conveniently, but to demonstrate the devotion and submission of her subjects through their willingness to participate in these time-consuming rituals. During the latter part of Marie Antoinette's reign, the Grande Toilette was modified to allow her to dress privately in her boudoir with only Mademoiselle Bertin, her preferred dressmaker, in attendance. This change reflected her growing discomfort with the public nature of royal existence and her desire for some degree of personal autonomy, but it also generated criticism from courtiers who viewed any deviation from traditional protocols as dangerous precedent. The Queen acknowledged each person present during the Grande Toilette with a nod, but direct conversation was not permitted during the dressing ceremony. This silent recognition served to reinforce the quasi-religious nature of the proceedings, where words might diminish the solemnity of the ritual transformation from private woman to public queen. The ceremony concluded with Marie Antoinette's emergence as a fully prepared royal figure, ready to assume her public duties for the remainder of the day. What psychological impact did this daily surrender of personal autonomy have on a young woman who had grown up with considerably more freedom? In the Austrian court, how did Marie Antoinette reconcile her private desires for simplicity and comfort with the public demands for magnificent display? And what did it mean for her sense of self to have even the most intimate aspects of her daily routine transformed into public ceremonies where her body became a symbol rather than simply her own physical reality? Following the completion of her morning toilette, Marie Antoinette's day continued with a carefully structured sequence of public appearances and ceremonial duties that reinforced her role as Queen of France while providing opportunities for political influence and social interaction. At 12:30, after her toilet was complete, she was accompanied by the Princess de Lamballe to attend daily mass, either in the tribune above the altar or below in the main body of the royal chapel, depending on the significance of the religious observance and the presence of other members of the royal family. The daily attendance at Mass was not merely a personal devotional practice, but a public demonstration of royal piety that reinforced the divine authority upon which monarchical power was based. Marie Antoinette's behavior during these services was scrutinized by courtiers and visiting dignitaries who interpreted her apparent devotion or distraction as indicators of her spiritual state and, by extension, her fitness to rule. The selection of her position in the chapel, whether in the royal tribune or among the congregation, communicated subtle messages about the importance of particular feast days and the royal family's relationship with the church hierarchy. 1 o'clock, the maître d'hôtel entered to present Marie Antoinette with the menu for the day's meals, a ceremony that elevated food selection to the level of state business. The menus were elaborate documents that listed not only the dishes to be served, but also their preparation methods, the sources of ingredients, and the personnel responsible for each course. This level of detail reflected both the importance of royal dining as public spectacle and the security concerns that surrounded royal food preparation. Public dining occurred every Sunday in the cabinet of the nobles, events that served multiple political and social functions beyond simple nutrition. These dinners provided opportunities for favored courtiers to demonstrate their proximity to royal power while allowing the king and queen to display their magnificence to carefully selected audiences. The ceremonies began with hand-washing rituals that emphasized the cleanliness and refinement that distinguished royal dining from the practices of lower social ranks. Marie Antoinette's eating habits during these public meals were notably restrained. She typically consumed only a small portion of meat and never drank wine, preferences that were carefully noted by observers who reported on royal behavior to their patrons and correspondents throughout Europe. Her comment that dinner was a quick meal because we both eat very fast suggests that these public dining experiences were more ordeal than pleasure, conducted under intense scrutiny that made natural enjoyment of food virtually impossible. Following dinner, Marie Antoinette visited the Dauphin's apartment, fulfilling her maternal duties under the watchful supervision of the child's official governors and attendants. These visits were constrained by protocols that limited her direct involvement in her children's daily care, a restriction that caused considerable frustration for a woman who had expected motherhood to provide some refuge from the artificial constraints of court life. Even her interactions with her own children were subject to political interpretation and official oversight. The afternoon hours from 1:30 were designated for correspondence, business affairs, and reading activities that required Marie Antoinette to remove her formal court attire and don a lighter gown of muslin or cotton. This costume change symbolized a transition from public queen to private person, though the distinction was largely fictional since her afternoon activities were monitored as closely as her morning ceremonies. Her correspondence was subject to review by court officials. Her business decisions required approval from advisors, and even her reading material was selected to avoid exposure to potentially dangerous ideas. The selection of afternoon reading material reflected the complex political environment in which Marie Antoinette lived. Books and pamphlets that might influence her thinking about governance, religion, or social issues were carefully screened to ensure that they supported rather than challenged the established order. This intellectual isolation was intended to protect her from corrupting influences, but it also limited her ability to understand the changing attitudes and emerging problems that would eventually threaten the monarchy itself. At 3 o'clock, Marie Antoinette again visited the king's aunts, and the king often joined these gatherings, providing opportunities for informal family conversation that was nonetheless governed by strict protocols regarding precedence and appropriate topics of discussion. These visits served important functions in maintaining family harmony and ensuring that the royal women presented a united front to the court and the broader public. The king's presence during these visits elevated their significance while providing him with opportunities to observe and influence the relationships between female members of his family. The 4 o'clock visit from the abbé represented one of the few purely educational experiences in Marie Antoinette's daily routine, though even this instruction was carefully tailored to reinforce rather than question royal prerogatives and Catholic orthodoxy. These sessions might involve discussion of theological questions, review of historical precedents for royal behavior, or analysis of contemporary political situations from perspectives that supported monarchical authority. The abbé's role was not to encourage independent thinking, but to provide intellectual justification for positions that Marie Antoinette was expected to hold. Music lessons at 5 o'clock represented one of the few areas where Marie Antoinette could experience genuine personal satisfaction and artistic achievement. Her harpsichord and singing lessons provided opportunities for creative expression that were less constrained by political considerations than most other aspects of her daily routine. Music was considered an appropriate feminine accomplishment that enhanced rather than threatened royal dignity, allowing her to develop genuine expertise in an area where personal preference could legitimately influence her choices. The evening, preparations beginning at 7 o'clock involved another elaborate costume change as Marie Antoinette prepared for whatever entertainment had been scheduled for that evening. These might include card games, theatrical performances, masked balls, or opera, each requiring specific attire and behavioral protocols. The selection and preparation of evening wear was almost as complex as the morning toilette, involving consideration of the other attendees, the political significance of the event, and the subtle messages that different choices of jewelry, fabrics, and accessories might communicate. Card games were particularly important social events that served as venues for political conversation and alliance building among courtiers. Marie Antoinette's participation in these games was carefully watched for signs of favor or disfavor toward particular players, and her wins or losses were interpreted as omens or indicators of royal fortune. Even recreational activities at Versailles carried political weight that transformed leisure into another form of royal duty. How did Marie Antoinette maintain her sanity and sense of personal identity within this suffocating framework of constant ceremony and surveillance? What strategies did she develop for finding moments of genuine human connection within the artificial environment of court life? And how did the relentless pressure to perform royalty rather than simply be royal affect her relationships with her husband, her children, and the people of France who would ultimately judge her performance? As the long day of ceremonial duties drew toward its close, Marie Antoinette faced yet another series of elaborate protocols that would govern her evening activities and bedtime preparations. Supper was served at 9 o'clock and followed many of the same ceremonial patterns as dinner, though the Queen ate more substantially during this meal, typically consuming bouillon, a chicken wing, and water with biscuits. If the king was not present, it was standard procedure for her to be served only by women, a practice that emphasized both the intimate nature of the evening meal and the concern for royal modesty that governed even the most basic social interactions. The evening hours provided some of the few opportunities for relatively informal conversation and entertainment, though even these moments of apparent relaxation were structured by protocols that determined who could attend, what topics could be discussed, and how long the gatherings could continue. Card games, musical performances, and literary discussions offered mental stimulation and social interaction, but they also served as venues for the subtle political maneuvering that characterized all aspects of court life. The nighttime toilette began at 11 o'clock and mirrored many aspects of the morning ceremony, though with the purpose of preparing for rest rather than public appearance. The ritual of undressing required the same attention to hierarchy and protocol as the morning dressing ceremony, with specific individuals responsible for removing different garments and presenting the nightwear that had been selected according to seasonal appropriateness and royal preference. The presentation of tomorrow's stockings during the evening toilette represented one of the most mundane, yet symbolically significant aspects of royal routine. This simple gesture emphasized the forward-planning nature of royal existence, where even the most basic clothing decisions were made in advance and subject to approval by multiple levels of court hierarchy. The worn garments from the day were immediately sent to the wardrobe room for repair or cleaning, maintaining the illusion that royal clothing was always perfect and new. Marie Antoinette's practice of wearing wax-lined gloves to bed represented both practical beauty care and symbolic isolation from normal human experience. These gloves were designed to maintain the softness and whiteness of her hands, essential attributes for a queen whose every gesture was scrutinized for signs of refinement or vulgarity. The image of sleeping in gloves captures the extent to which royal existence was artificial, requiring constant maintenance of an impossible standard of physical perfection. The final ceremony of each day involved participation in the king's couture, a male-only ritual that paralleled the queen's own bedtime preparations. After this ceremony concluded, Marie Antoinette's door was bolted, creating a symbolic barrier between the public queen and the private woman, though this privacy was more theoretical than real given the presence of sleeping attendants and the constant awareness that royal behavior was never truly unobserved. The psychological toll of this daily routine was immense, and Marie Antoinette increasingly sought refuge at the Petit Trianon, a smaller palace that Louis XVI had given her shortly after becoming king. At Petit Trianon, she was not required to endure the same strict etiquette that governed life at Versailles, and this retreat became essential for her mental and emotional survival within the constraints of royal existence. At Petit Trianon, Marie Antoinette could often be seen strolling through the gardens incognito, wearing a simple muslin dress and sporting a floppy hat, a costume that represented the antithesis of court formality and her desperate desire for ordinary human experience. These walks provided her only opportunities for solitude and unstructured time, moments when she could temporarily escape the constant performance required by her royal role. The gardens at Petit Trianon were designed in the English style, emphasizing natural landscapes over the geometric formality of traditional French garden design. This aesthetic choice reflected Marie Antoinette's preference for simplicity and her rejection of the artificial constraints that characterized every other aspect
of her existence.
The informal pathways, irregular plantings, and rustic buildings created an environment where she could pretend, however briefly, to be an ordinary person enjoying the simple pleasures of nature. The famous hameau or model village that Marie Antoinette constructed at Petit Trianon represented the ultimate expression of her desire for authentic experience within the artificial world of royal privilege. This collection of thatched cottages, working farms, and rustic buildings allowed her to play at being a simple countrywoman complete with carefully maintained livestock and servants dressed as peasants. Critics would later point to this elaborate fantasy as evidence of her disconnection from reality, but it might more accurately be understood as a desperate attempt to maintain some connection to normal human experience. The daily routine at Petit Trianon was deliberately unstructured, allowing Marie Antoinette to wake when she pleased, dress in simple clothing, and spend her time according to personal preference rather than ceremonial obligation. She could read books of her own choosing, engage in conversations without political ulterior motives, and experience the luxury of boredom that was impossible within the relentless schedule of Versailles court life. Even at Petit Trianon, however, complete escape from royal responsibility was impossible. Her retreats to this private paradise were themselves subject to political interpretation, with critics arguing that her absence from Versailles demonstrated indifference to royal duty and contempt for French traditions. The time she spent in apparent frivolity at Petit Trianon would later be used as evidence against her during the Revolution, when prosecutors argued that her expensive private pleasures had contributed to the financial crisis that brought down the monarchy. The contrast between Marie Antoinette's public performance as Queen of France and her private desires for simplicity and autonomy created internal tensions that would influence her behavior throughout her reign. Her attempts to carve out spaces for personal authenticity within the artificial constraints of royal existence were interpreted by many observers as evidence of character flaws rather than natural human responses to impossible circumstances. The daily theatrical production of queenship required Marie Antoinette to suppress her individual personality in favor of a royal persona that met the expectations of courtiers, subjects, and foreign observers. This constant performance was exhausting and ultimately unsustainable, contributing to the personal and political crises that would eventually destroy both her and the monarchy she represented. How did this relentless schedule of ceremony and protocol affect Marie Antoinette's ability to understand and respond to the real problems facing France during her reign? What would her life have been like if she had been born into a different era or a different social position? And what lessons might modern leaders learn from examining the ways in which excessive formality and artificial constraint can isolate decision-makers from the realities they are supposed to govern? By the late 1780s, the elaborate ceremonies and protocols that had governed Marie Antoinette's daily existence at Versailles began to seem increasingly hollow as France faced mounting financial crises and social unrest. The same rigid system that had once symbolized monarchical power and divine authority now appeared as evidence of aristocratic waste and indifference to popular suffering. The queen, who had once been celebrated for her fashion and beauty, became a target for growing resentment among French people who blamed royal extravagance for the nation's economic troubles. The financial situation that would ultimately destroy the monarchy had been building for decades before Marie Antoinette's arrival in France, but the timing of the crisis coincided with her reign in ways that made her a convenient scapegoat for problems far beyond her control or understanding. The costs of France's involvement in foreign wars, particularly the expensive support for American independence, had created debt burdens that traditional taxation methods could not address. The complex system of tax exemptions that protected noble and clerical wealth while burdening ordinary citizens had become unsustainable, but efforts at reform threatened the privileged position of the very people upon whom royal authority depended. Marie Antoinette's personal spending, while substantial by ordinary standards, represented only a tiny fraction of royal expenditures and an even smaller portion of the national debt. However, her visible enjoyment of luxury and her association with expensive court ceremonies made her an obvious target for critics who needed someone to blame for France's financial troubles. Pamphlets and satirical songs began to circulate that portrayed her as a foreign spendthrift who cared nothing for French suffering, images that would prove impossible to counteract once they became embedded in popular consciousness. The Queen's Austrian birth created additional vulnerabilities as political tensions increased throughout the 1780s. France's traditional rivalry with Austria made any foreign-born queen suspect, but Marie Antoinette's continued correspondence with her family in Vienna provided ammunition for critics who questioned her loyalty to French interests. When diplomatic crises arose between France and Austria, she was automatically suspected of serving as a spy or traitor, regardless of her actual involvement in political decisions. The social changes occurring throughout French society during this period made the elaborate court rituals at Versailles seem increasingly anachronistic and offensive to growing numbers of French citizens. Enlightenment ideas about individual rights and social equality challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which monarchical authority was based, while economic hardships made royal luxury appear morally indefensible. The same ceremonies that had once inspired awe and respect began to generate anger and resentment among people who could no longer afford basic necessities. Marie Antoinette's attempts to maintain normal court life in the face of mounting criticism only intensified popular hostility toward the monarchy. Her continued expenditures on clothing, jewelry, and entertainment at Petit Trianon were interpreted as evidence of callous indifference to popular suffering, while her apparent inability to understand why such criticism was justified demonstrated the complete disconnect between royal and common experience that had developed over centuries of absolute monarchy. The summoning of the Estates General in 1789 marked the beginning of the end for the world that Marie Antoinette had inhabited since her arrival in France 19 years earlier. This assembly, which had not been convened since 1614, represented an acknowledgement that traditional methods of governance had failed and that fundamental changes would be necessary to address France's crisis. For Marie Antoinette, whose entire identity was bound up with the existing system, these developments represented not just political challenges but threats to her very sense of self. The early months of the Revolution brought a series of shocks that shattered the comfortable assumptions about social order that had governed Marie Antoinette's entire adult life. The tennis court oath, the storming of the Bastille, and the Great Fear that swept through rural France demonstrated that the monarchy's authority was crumbling and that new forces were emerging to challenge royal prerogatives. The abolition of feudalism and the declaration of the rights of man and citizen represented direct attacks on the hierarchical principles that had justified royal privilege. The October days of 1789, when crowds of Parisian women marched to Versailles, demanding bread and forcing the royal family to return to Paris, marked the end of Marie Antoinette's life as Queen of France in any meaningful sense. The magnificent palace that had been her home and stage for nearly 2 decades was abandoned as she and her family were essentially taken prisoner by revolutionary crowds who no longer recognized royal authority or royal rights. The move to the Tuileries Palace in Paris placed the royal family under constant surveillance by revolutionary authorities and hostile crowds who gathered daily outside their windows. The elaborate protocols that had once structured Marie Antoinette's days were replaced by the uncertainty and fear that characterized life as prisoners of the revolution. The queen, who had once commanded the attention of hundreds of courtiers, now found herself isolated and powerless, dependent on the mercy of people who increasingly viewed her as an enemy of the nation. The attempted flight to Varennes in June 1791 represented Marie Antoinette's most desperate effort to escape the revolutionary situation and restore royal authority through foreign intervention. The failure of this escape attempt destroyed any remaining sympathy for the royal family among moderate revolutionaries and confirmed suspicions that they were actively conspiring against the revolution. For Marie Antoinette, the humiliating return to Paris under guard marked the definitive end of any hope for restoring the old order. The declaration of war against Austria in 1792 placed Marie Antoinette in an impossible position as the daughter of the enemy emperor and the wife of the French king. Her family connections, which had once been valuable diplomatic assets, now became evidence of treason in the eyes of revolutionary prosecutors. Every letter she had written to her relatives, every conversation she had held with Austrian diplomats, every gesture of homesickness or nostalgia for her homeland was reinterpreted as proof of her fundamental disloyalty to France. The storming of the Tuileries Palace on August 10, 1792, and the suspension of royal authority marked the beginning of the final phase of Marie Antoinette's life. The massacres that accompanied this event demonstrated the violent hatred that many French people had developed toward the monarchy and its representatives. The royal family's transfer to the Temple prison represented their transformation from constitutional monarchs to common criminals awaiting trial for crimes against the state. The execution of Louis XVI on January 21, 1793, left Marie Antoinette a widow and removed the last vestiges of royal protection that might have shielded her from revolutionary justice. As the former queen of a deposed monarchy, she had no remaining political value to moderate revolutionaries who might have preferred exile to execution. Her fate was now entirely in the hands of radical politicians who viewed her death as necessary for the security of the revolutionary state. What psychological resources did Marie Antoinette draw upon to survive the collapse of everything she had believed about social order and royal authority? How did a woman who had lived her entire adult life according to elaborate protocols adapt to the chaos and uncertainty of revolutionary imprisonment? And what did it mean for someone whose identity had been so completely bound up with royal ceremony to face the prospect of dying, not as a queen, but as a convicted traitor? The 18 months that Marie Antoinette spent imprisoned in the Temple Tower represented a gradual stripping away of the royal identity that had defined her existence. Since her arrival in France as a teenage bride, the woman who had once awakened each morning to elaborate ceremonies of dressing and grooming now found herself in a small, sparsely furnished room where privacy was impossible and dignity was a luxury she could no longer afford. The transformation from Queen of France to prisoner number 280 required psychological adjustments that would have challenged even someone better prepared for adversity. Life in the Temple prison followed routines that were deliberately designed to emphasize the royal family's powerlessness and dependence on their captors. The morning awakening came not with the ceremonial presentation of clothing options, but with the harsh commands of guards who showed no deference to former royal status. Marie Antoinette was required to dress herself in simple clothing provided by the revolutionary government, garments that bore no resemblance to the elaborate gowns that had once announced her status to everyone who encountered her. The daily schedule in the temple was structured around the convenience of the guards rather than the preferences of the prisoners. Meals were served at designated times and consisted of simple fare that represented a dramatic change from the elaborate cuisine that had characterized royal dining at Versailles. Marie Antoinette, who had once picked delicately at small portions, during ceremonial meals now had to adapt to plain bread, soup, and occasional meat that was often poorly prepared and sometimes barely edible. The psychological impact of this dietary change extended far beyond mere nutrition. Food had been one of the primary ways that royal status was displayed and maintained at Versailles, with elaborate meals serving as demonstrations of wealth, taste, and cultural sophistication. The reduction to prison rations represented not just physical discomfort, but a fundamental assault on the symbols that had defined royal identity for centuries. Personal hygiene, which had once involved elaborate rituals conducted by teams of specialized attendants, became a private struggle conducted with minimal resources and constant awareness of surveillance. Marie Antoinette had to learn to care for her own basic needs without the army of servants who had anticipated her every requirement throughout her adult life. The simple act of washing her face or combing her hair became a reminder of how completely her world had changed. The presence of her children in the temple provided both comfort and additional anguish for Marie Antoinette. As a mother, she wanted to protect them from the harsh realities of their situation. But as a former queen, she was painfully aware that their imprisonment represented the complete destruction of the dynastic expectations that had shaped their upbringing. Watching her son, the former Dauphin, adapt to prison life must have been particularly heartbreaking for a woman who had been taught to believe in the divine nature of royal authority. The educational routines that had once occupied the royal children were replaced by the grim necessities of prison survival. Instead of learning languages, history, and courtly graces, the children had to adapt to confinement, uncertainty, and the constant awareness that their lives depended on the political decisions of people who viewed them as enemies of the state. Marie Antoinette's attempts to maintain some semblance of normal family life under these circumstances required enormous emotional strength and creativity. Communication with the outside world was severely restricted, cutting Marie Antoinette off from the networks of family and friends who had provided emotional support throughout her reign. Letters were censored or forbidden entirely, leaving her isolated with her fears and grief without the comfort of familiar relationships. The woman who had once been at the center of European diplomatic correspondence was now reduced to speculation and rumors about events beyond the prison walls. The transfer to the conciergerie on the night of August 2, 1793 marked an even more dramatic reduction in Marie Antoinette's circumstances. Separated from her children and sister-in-law, who remained in the temple, she was now completely alone except for the guards who watched her constantly. The cell in the conciergerie was smaller and more prison-like than her quarters in the temple, emphasizing her transition from political prisoner to criminal defendant awaiting trial. The physical conditions in the conciergerie were deliberately harsh, designed to break the spirit of prisoners and encourage confessions or cooperation with revolutionary authorities. Marie Antoinette's cell was damp, poorly lit, and furnished only with a simple bed, a table, and a chair. The contrast with the luxurious apartments she had once inhabited at Versailles could not have been more stark or more psychologically devastating. The constant surveillance in the conciergerie eliminated any possibility of privacy or personal reflection. Guards were instructed to watch her at all times, preventing suicide attempts, but also ensuring that she could never escape awareness of her powerless situation. The woman who had once retired each evening behind bolted doors to private apartments now lived under the constant gaze of hostile strangers who viewed her as a dangerous enemy of the people. Personal possessions were reduced to absolute necessities, with any items that might have provided comfort or connection to her former life either confiscated or forbidden. The jewelry, books, and personal mementos that had once surrounded her were replaced by the stark emptiness of a prison cell designed to emphasize her complete dependence on revolutionary mercy. This material deprivation represented yet another assault on the psychological foundations of royal identity. The preparation for trial required Marie Antoinette to confront the complete transformation of her public identity from beloved queen to accused traitor. The charges being prepared against her reinterpreted every aspect of her life in France as evidence of criminal conspiracy against the people. Her correspondence with family members became proof of espionage. Her expenditures on court ceremonies became evidence of financial crimes, and her attempts to maintain royal dignity became proof of contempt for popular sovereignty. The final weeks before her trial were marked by increasing physical deterioration, as the stress of imprisonment and the prospect of execution took their toll on her health. The woman who had once been celebrated for her beauty and fashion sense was now gaunt, prematurely aged, and dressed in the simple black clothing appropriate for a widow and defendant. The The transformation was so complete that many observers who had known her during her years as queen barely recognized the broken woman who appeared before the revolutionary tribunal. How did Marie Antoinette maintain her sanity during these months of isolation and degradation? What internal resources allowed her to preserve some sense of dignity and purpose when everything external that had defined her identity had been stripped away? And what thoughts occupied her mind during the long nights in her prison cell as she waited for the trial that would almost certainly end with her execution? On the night of October 12, 1793, Marie Antoinette was awakened from her restless sleep and brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal to be formally indicted. The charges against her represented a comprehensive indictment of royal authority itself, transforming her entire life story into a criminal narrative that would justify her execution. After denying the charges listed against her, she was granted the right to legal counsel and returned to her cell to await what everyone understood would be a show trial designed to provide legal justification for a predetermined verdict. The preparation time allowed for her defense was deliberately inadequate to mount any meaningful challenge to the prosecution's case. Unlike Louis XVI, who had been given weeks to prepare his defense, Marie Antoinette had only hours. Her head lawyer, Claude-François Chauveau-Lagarde, urged her to request additional time from the tribunal, and she did so, but her request was ignored. This denial of adequate preparation time ensured that her trial would proceed according to the political timeline required by her accusers rather than the legal standards that might have provided some protection. The trial began on October 14, 1793, with Marie Antoinette appearing before the court pale and sickly, dressed in widow's black. Her physical appearance shocked many observers who had expected to see the fierce Austrian she-wolf of revolutionary propaganda, but instead encountered a broken woman who bore little resemblance to the magnificent queen who had once commanded the attention of European courts. This transformation was itself a kind of victory for the revolution, demonstrating its power to humble even the most exalted representatives of the old order. The trial proceedings were conducted with an appearance of legal formality that masked their fundamentally political nature. 40 witnesses were called to testify against her during hours of grueling cross-examination, but the evidence presented was largely based on rumors, hearsay, and political interpretation, rather than the documented facts that had characterized her husband's trial. The prosecution's case relied more on popular hatred of the monarchy than on specific proof of criminal behavior. Marie Antoinette's responses to the allegations were characterized by short, non-committal replies. "I do not recall, and I never heard talk of anything like that." This defensive strategy reflected both her genuine lack of involvement in many of the alleged conspiracies and her lawyer's advice to avoid providing additional ammunition for the prosecution. Her denials were consistent and dignified, but they could not overcome the political necessity that drove the proceedings toward her condemnation. When questioned about specific documents allegedly bearing her signature, Marie Antoinette demonstrated the logical inconsistencies in the prosecution's case by asking for dates. It was revealed that some documents were supposedly signed after she was already imprisoned, making her alleged crimes chronologically impossible. However, such factual problems were irrelevant to a tribunal more interested in political symbolism than legal accuracy. The only area where Marie Antoinette showed any accommodation to her accusers was regarding expenditures on Petit Trianon. "Perhaps more was spent than I would have wished." This admission reflected her recognition that some criticism of royal spending was justified, but it also demonstrated her continued failure to understand the extent to which popular anger had moved beyond specific grievances to fundamental rejection of monarchical authority itself. The most shocking moment of the trial came when prosecutor Heber introduced charges of incest involving her young son. At this accusation, Marie Antoinette's composure finally cracked. Did you witness it? She snapped at Hébert, refusing to comment further on the charge. When pressed by the tribunal's president to explain her refusal to respond, she delivered what would become one of her most famous statements. If I have not replied, it is because nature itself refuses to respond to such a charge laid against a mother. This response revealed both her genuine outrage at the false accusation and her fundamental inability to comprehend the political dynamics that made even the most absurd charges useful to her prosecutors. The incest allegation was not intended to be believed, but rather to demonstrate the complete degradation of royal dignity and the revolution's power to destroy any remaining respect for monarchical authority. The trial continued for 2 full days, adjourning at 11 p.m. on October 14th and resuming at 8 a.m. the following morning for another 16 hours of proceedings. This exhausting schedule was designed to wear down the defendant's resistance while creating an appearance of thorough legal examination. The marathon proceedings served the prosecution's political purposes while denying Marie Antoinette adequate rest or time for reflection between sessions. At 4 a.m. on October 16, 1793, she was found guilty of 3 main charges: conspiring with foreign powers, depleting the state treasury, and committing high treason by acting against the security of the French state. The prosecution requested and was granted the death penalty, completing the legal formalities required to justify her execution. When asked if she had anything to say about the sentence, Marie Antoinette simply shook her head, perhaps recognizing the futility of further protest. Her final hours were spent writing farewell letters, including a remarkable document addressed to Madame Elizabeth, in which she forgave her enemies and expressed hope that her death might help restore peace to France. This letter revealed both her continued faith in divine providence and her genuine love for the country that was about to execute her. Her refusal to eat breakfast on her final morning suggested either complete loss of appetite or a desire to face death with dignity. At 11 a.m. on October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette was taken to the guillotine in an open cart, a journey that took her through the streets of Paris past crowds of people who had come to witness the execution of their former queen. The contrast between this final procession and the magnificent bridal journey that had brought her to France 23 years earlier could not have been more complete or more symbolic of the revolutionary transformation of French society. She was guillotined at 12:15 p.m., just 2.5 weeks before her 38th birthday. Her death marked not only the end of her personal story, but also the symbolic completion of the revolution's destruction of the old regime. The execution of the former Queen of France demonstrated that no social position was sacred enough to protect its holder from revolutionary justice, and that the new order would be built upon the complete rejection of traditional hierarchies. The historical legacy of Marie Antoinette has been shaped more by political symbolism than by careful examination of her actual role in the events that led to the revolution. For revolutionaries, she represented everything evil about the old regime: foreign influence, aristocratic excess, and indifference to popular suffering. For royalists, she became a martyr whose death exemplified revolutionary brutality and the destruction of legitimate authority. Both interpretations simplified a complex human story into political propaganda. Modern historians have generally concluded that Marie Antoinette was more victim than villain, a young woman who was never adequately prepared for the responsibilities thrust upon her, and who became a scapegoat for problems that had developed over decades before her arrival in France. Her personal spending, while substantial, was not a significant cause of the financial crisis that brought down the monarchy. Her political influence was limited by both her gender and her foreign birth, making her an unlikely mastermind of counter-revolutionary conspiracy. Yet the symbolic importance of her story extends beyond questions of individual guilt or innocence. Her life and death represented the collision between an old world based on hereditary privilege and divine right, and a new world based on popular sovereignty and individual rights. The elaborate ceremonies that had once defined her daily existence came to symbolize everything that the revolution sought to destroy, while her execution demonstrated the power of popular movements to challenge even the most entrenched forms of authority. The story of Marie Antoinette reminds us that individual lives are often swept up in historical forces far beyond their control or understanding. Her transformation from Austrian Archduchess to French Queen to revolutionary victim illustrates the fragility of social systems that appear permanent and the devastating personal consequences that can result from political upheaval. Whether viewed as tragic victim or symbol of aristocratic excess, her story continues to fascinate because it embodies the human drama inherent in moments of fundamental historical change. What lessons might modern leaders learn from examining the ways in which Marie Antoinette's isolation from ordinary experience contributed to her inability to understand or respond effectively to the changing world around her? How might different choices or different circumstances have altered the trajectory of her story and the history of France itself? And what does her experience teach us about the relationship between personal character and historical circumstance in shaping the destinies of individuals and nations?